Al-Birwa was a Palestinian Arab village located 10.5 kilometers east of Acre. In 1945, it had population of 1,460, of whom the majority were Muslims and a significant minority, Christians. Its total land area consisted of 13,542 dunams. The village was depopulated during the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. Al-Birwa was mentioned in the mid-11th century CE by the Persian geographer Acre In and was known to the Crusaders as Broe. The village came under Mamluk rule in the late 13th century, and in the early 16th century, it was conquered by the Ottomans, who ruled it for 4 centuries. Travelers' reports from the late 19th century documented that Al-Birwa had a mosque, a church, and an elementary school for boys. During British Mandate rule in Palestine, Al-Birwa was home to local power brokers who mediated disputes in neighboring villages. Al-Birwa became a center of rebel operations during the 1936 to 1939 revolt against British rule. By the 1940s, many of the village's agrarian inhabitants lost the land due to debt, and shifted to labor jobs in nearby cities, such as Haifa. However, the majority of the residents, men and women, continued to engage in farming, selling their olives, grains and other crops in the markets of Acre. Al-Birwa was captured by the Israelis in early June 1948, after which its local militia recaptured the village. Al-Birwa was then permanently occupied by the Israelis in late June. Afterward, its inhabitants, including future Palestinian poet Mahmoud Darwish, fled to nearby villages in Lebanon. The Jewish communities of Yasserah and Ahihad were established on Al-Birwa's lands in 1949 and 1950, respectively. History. Middle Ages. Al-Birwa was mentioned in 1047 CE, during Fatimid rule, when it was visited by the Persian geographer Acre. He describes it as lying between Acre and Daman, and reports having visited what he described as the tombs of Simeon and Esau there. The Crusaders wrested control of Palestine from the Fatimids in 1099. They referred to Al-Birwa as Broe. In 1253, John Aylman, the Crusader lord of Caesarea, sold Al-Birwa, along with several other villages, to the Knights Hospitaller. Al-Birwa was mentioned as part of the Acre-based Crusaders' domain in the 1283 Hudna with the Mamluks under Sultan al-Mansur Kalawan. In the late 13th century, the Mamluks defeated and conquered the last Crusader outposts along Palestine's northern coastline. Ottoman era. Al-Birwa came under Ottoman rule in 1517, along with all of Palestine. In 1596, Al-Birwa was a small village in the Acre Nahiyat, part of the Safad Sanjak. The village paid taxes on wheat, barley, fruit, beehives, and goats. According to Ottoman tax registers, Al-Birwa had 121 residents in 1596. A map from Napoleon's invasion of 1799 by French cartographer Pierre-Jacques depicted Al-Birwa as Beraway, though its location on the map was misplaced. In the late 19th century, Al-Birwa grew to be a large village, with a well in its southern area. To the north lay beautiful olive groves and fruitful wheat fields, as they were described by one Western traveler to the region in the mid-19th century. American biblical scholar Edward Robinson visited Al-Birwa in 1852 and noted that it was one of 18 villages in Palestine with an operating Christian church. By 1859, British consul Edward T. Rogers recorded that Al-Birwa had approximately 900 inhabitants. The French explorer Acre In, who visited in 1875, described the Christians of Birwa as Greek Orthodox, and noted that they had a fairly new church. In 1888, the Ottomans built an elementary school for boys. British Mandate period in 1917. During World War I, British forces drove out the Ottomans from Palestine, and in 1920, the British Mandate of Palestine was established. In the 1922 British census, Al-Birwa had a population of 807, consisting of 735 Muslims and 72 Christians. The Christians were mostly Orthodox with 5 Anglicans. By the 1931 census, the population had increased to 996, of which 884 were Muslims and 92 were Christians, living in a total of 224 houses. Cement roofs became widely used in Al-Birwa in the 1930s, during a time of significant expansion in the village. A number of Al-Birwa's inhabitants participated in the 1936 to 1939 Arab revolt against British rule and mass Jewish immigration in Palestine. A commander of the revolt for the Nazareth Tiberias region, Sheikh Yahya Wash, was from Al-Birwa. He was arrested by the British and sentenced to life imprisonment. The British also executed 8 residents of Al-Birwa who had participated in the revolt. Other rebel commanders and participants in the revolt from Al-Birwa included Assadat Allah, Mahmoud al-Judi, Salah Mahmoud Ma'ari, Abu Sayyidi, Abd al-Hamid Damirari, Muhammad al-Hajj Ali, Yusuf Taha, Faidlid, Yusuf Ma'nabas al-Shatawi. A number of women from Al-Birwa participated in the revolt by transporting arms, water and food to rebels positioned among the hills in the vicinity. Elderly refugees from Al-Birwa interviewed in 2003-2004 recalled that during the revolt, local rebels set off a mine that hit a British military jeep on a road adjacent to Al-Birwa in August 1937, prompting the British to launch punitive measures against the village. In particular, the British authorities gathered men from Al-Birwa and forced them to cut cactus plants near Acre and then placed the men on top of the cactuses. In 1945, Al-Birwa's population was 1,460, of which 130 were Christians. Prominent families and landowners in the village included the Saad, Darwish, Abdullah Khail, Sakas, Al-Waqid, Al-Judi, Najm, Al-Dabdub, Khalid, Akawi, Hussein, Hawash and Al-Shaker families. Socio-economic status in the village was largely determined by land ownership. About 140 residents of the village were tenant farmers who worked for the major land-owning Morabi, Al-Zayyat and Adlabi families. According to intelligence gathered by the Haganah, the traditional local power brokers of the Central Galilee were residents of Al-Birwa, who resolved all conflicts in the nearby villages. Haganah intelligence also reported that Al-Birwa's inhabitants were long-lived, the majority reaching an age of over 100 years. By the 1940s, Al-Birwa had 3 olive oil presses, a mosque, a church, and approximately 300 houses. In addition to the Ottoman-era boys' school, an elementary school for girls was established in 1943. By this time, many of the inhabitants lost all or part of their lands due to debts, and concurrently, men and women from Al-Birwa increasingly worked in public projects, such as road construction and the Haifa oil refinery, or in British military installations, to compensate for lost income. However, the main source of income remained agriculture, and the village's principal crops were olives, wheat, barley, corn, sesame, and watermelons. In 1944-45, residents of the village owned a total of 600 cattle, 3,000 goats and 1,000 chickens. Women, particularly young women from smaller landowning families, participated alongside the men of the family in working the land, while many women from landless families drew income as seasonal workers on other village residents' lands. There were general involved gender-based divisions of labor, with women collecting well water, raising livestock, curding milk, transporting goods to markets in Acre and collecting herbs. Men typically plowed and sowed seeds, and both men and women picked olives and harvested crops. 1948 war. Israeli forces from the Carmeli Brigade first captured Al-Birwa and positions overlooking it on the 11th of June 1948 as part of Operation Ben Ami, a day before the first truce of the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. During the fighting, 45 elderly residents hid in the church with the priest. The defenders of the village surrendered after losing men and running out of ammunition. The residents took refuge in nearby villages for 13 days. Nevertheless, clashes continued during the truce. According to local militiamen from Al-Birwa, 96 men from the village armed with rifles, and an equal amount of men armed with non-firearms and unarmed women assembled near the front lines of the Arab Liberation Army. The rifle-armed force charged first across the front lines, followed by the men armed with axes, shovels, and sticks, and then the women who carried water to assist the wounded. Al-Birwa's ad hoc militia took the small force of Haganah soldiers by surprise and forced them back a kilometer west of Al-Birwa. Afterward, Al-Birwa's residents harvested the crops. They remained in the village until the 24th of June, when Ayla commanders suggested that they join the families in the nearby villages. The militiamen claimed that the Ayla stood by during the clashes because they did not receive orders from the superiors. The Israelis announced that they had battled Ayla units in the area, inflicting 100 casualties on the 25th of June. The New York Times reported that there was fighting in the village for 2 days and that United Nations observers were there investigating truce violations. It added that a small Israeli garrison held Al-Birwa prior to the truce, but it fell to Ayla troops based in Nazareth who launched a surprise attack. Some residents camped in the outskirts of the village and occasionally managed to enter and gather personal belongings. After the end of the first truce in mid-July, Al-Birwa was captured by Israel during Operation Dekel. The Ayla fought the Israelis to recapture Al-Birwa, but by the 18th of July, the village was firmly behind Israeli lines. Aftermath. On the 20th of August 1948, the Jewish National Fund called for building a settlement on some of Al-Birwa's lands, and on the 6th of January 1949, Jasser, a kibbutz, was established there. In 1950, the Moshav of Ahihud was inaugurated on the village's western lands. According to Palestinian historian Walid Khalidi, one of Al-Birwa's schools, 2 shrines for local sages, and 3 houses remain standing as of 1982. One of the shrines was domed and built of stone. Most of the structures stood amid cacti, weeds, olive and fig groves, and mulberry trees. Most of Al-Birwa's inhabitants fled to nearby Arab towns and villages, including Tamra, Kabul, Jddmak, Kafr Yusuf, and other localities. Some fled to Lebanon, and ended up in the Shatila refugee camp, in the outskirts of Beirut, where Palestinian historian Hafez Nassel interviewed them in 1973. Among the refugees of Al-Birwa was Mahmoud Darwish, who was born in the village in 1941 and lived part of his childhood there. In 1950, Tawfiq Toubi, an Arab member of the Knesset, raised the issue of the internally displaced refugees of Al-Birwa in the Knesset, demanding that they be allowed to return to their homes. Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion replied in the negative, stating, "The questioner presented the facts inaccurately. Birwa is an abandoned village which was destroyed in the fighting. Its inhabitants cooperated with Khakji's gangs. The Israel Defense Forces and the government did not treat them as they deserved, but permitted them to remain in villages near Birwa, and to become residents of Israel. The government of Israel treats them as it does the other residents of Israel and those lacking means of subsistence. A special body was established to deal with these refugees, to resettle and rehabilitate them, not necessarily in the former villages, and the resettlement of the refugees in Nazareth has already begun. Quote, in December 1951, the village site was declared a closed military zone. Geography. Al-Birwa stood on a rocky hill overlooking the Acre Plain, with an average elevation of 60 meters above sea level. It was situated at the intersection of two highways, one led to Acre and the other towards Haifa. Located 10.5 kilometers east of Acre, the other nearest localities to Al-Birwa included Al-Daman to the south, and the Arab towns of Jadida to the northwest, Julis to the north, Sha'ab to the east, and Majd al-Quran to the northeast. Al-Birwa's total land area consisted of 13,542 dunams, of which 59 dunams were built-up areas, of which 130 were Christians. Cultivable land accounted for 77% of the total land area. Orchards were planted on 1,548 dunams, of which 1,500 were used for olive groves, while 8,457 were allotted to grains. The residents of the town sold 536 dunams to Jews, and most of the rest was Arab-owned. Archaeology. In October 2002, a salvage excavation was conducted at the site on behalf of the Israel Antiquities Authority. Finds include a large building, numerous potsherds from the late Roman period, a bronze coin from the 1st to 2nd century CE, remains of an ancient olive press, glass vessels such as a wine goblet and bottles dated to the late Byzantine and Umayyad periods, and an underground water reservoir. A few potsherds from the Crusader and Mamluk periods were also found.